The concept of sustainable design has gotten increasing traction for the past few decades, I would say. Ever since the oil crisis of 1979, buildings and building regulations have sought of ways to enhance that energy performance. However, in more recent decades, this concept of sustainable design has become coupled with marketing. This is not necessarily a bad thing, as we need this attention and this demand, this desirability for sustainable design, but it does bring with it some unwanted factors. Some agents have been using this new hype as a marketing strategy or a punchline rather than as a true design philosophy, which is why I wanted to make this video. I will address the challenges I see we're facing when dealing with sustainable design, what I believe we're doing wrong as architects and as a society as a whole, and I will also share my own take and approach towards sustainable design. So hope you enjoy, and with that being said, let's dive in. Now, I live and work in Brussels, Belgium, well, just off Brussels. And here the legislation is quite strong. So strong, in fact, that we architects tend to use our creativity elsewhere, given that whatever we do, our buildings are going to be sustainable one way or the other. I believe that the challenge actually lies in this concept of sustainability, which is just too broad. There's no real consensus of what sustainability really is. For some, sustainability is reducing the carbon footprint of the building when it's being built, so the embodied energy. For others, it's the running energy, so reducing energy consumption, which is, I would say, the majority. And then for yet other people, it's adding biodiversity or using a certain type of materials, which are just better for the environment. And yet for others, it's all of the above. This poses a challenge because then we focus our attention on what we can actually measure, which is the energy consumption in most cases, which is why this is so popular. This is at best a shallow approach because it tells only part of the story. A house that consumes twice as much as the next one, considered less sustainable than the other one. But what if I told you that this house is twice the size and houses 3 times as many people? Would that make it sustainable? So again, I think it's only part of the story. And let's not forget, it's not houses or buildings that consume the energy, it's the people inside them. But let's put a pin on that for now. Let's be clear, measuring energy consumption is crucial. I do believe in the famous motto that says that which gets measured gets managed. I do come back to my buildings and measure their energy consumption and see how they're performing overall. And I see this as part of the story. I'm never going to come to a conclusion just based on the consumption. Sort of like a doctor will never come to a diagnosis of a patient based off of just one simple symptom. The same could be said to an extent about energy consumption. Labeling and certification systems have come up to the challenge, and they're great, but as great as they may be, they come down to a simple box-ticking exercise. It's more of a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up one. And of course, a building that ranks higher will perform better overall than one that ranks lower, and that is part of the purpose of these systems. But this would be under the premise of these buildings being under the same conditions. And that is part of the problem, part of the challenge, because there is no such thing as same conditions. The context of a building and their users vary enormously, which makes it impossible for buildings to be comparable one to the other. Furthermore, I strongly believe that sustainability has much more to add to the table than merely reducing energy consumption. What we're doing wrong. The chase after these sustainable labels have led certain agents to just want to slap sustainability into a project. So they want to get the look and feel of a sustainable project by simply adding it as an afterthought. They add solar panels here and they sprinkle some green roofs over there, and we pass on that project as sustainable. That's just not the case, at least not in my book. Even worse, I've seen fully glazed buildings in what would be warm climates, like in Madrid, for instance, following the trend of international style, and yet they're being passed on as sustainable. These are fully glazed buildings without any solar protection whatsoever. Yet they can pass on as sustainable simply because the energy they draw comes from sustainable sources. And again, I don't believe that this is sustainable. I myself really started looking into sustainability when I was very young, when I was training as an architect, very early on in my career. And I was always focusing on this aspect of energy consumption. I was trying to reduce it. Why? Well, because I felt it as my responsibility, being an architect, being that buildings account for 40% of all energy consumption according to the European Commission of Statistics. So because of this, like many, I was trying to reduce the carbon footprint of my projects. However, as I went further and further down the rabbit hole, my focus shifted somewhat. I stopped focusing on the energy consumption itself, and I started focusing on what triggers that consumption, which is again what we said before, the people using those spaces, using those buildings. I still feel that same responsibility, but what is driving me now is no longer how can I reduce the energy consumption, but rather the question, how can I design my buildings in such a way that they're in such communion with their environment that the occupants inside do not feel the need to mechanically condition their spaces. The ultimate result in a way is the same. I'm reducing the carbon footprint of my buildings by reducing the energy consumption. The way to get there is completely different. Now I see this reduction in energy consumption as a happy offset of what I'm truly trying to achieve, which are spaces in which one simply feels at ease with little or no artificial input. So how do I achieve this? Well, on the one hand, I have to study the context. That means the climate. As you will see in another video where I show you how I approach the Belgian climate, and I will share with you my analysis. And then once I have that, I have to balance it with thermal comfort. And comfort is a lot trickier than one would think. The conditions that will make you comfortable are probably not the conditions that make me comfortable or just don't meet my requirements, or vice versa. How we approach this is yet to be discussed on yet another video. Trying to match comfort with climate is not something new I am bringing to the table now in 2024. I mean, it's what's been going on since the dawn of architecture all the way up to the industrial era. And I'm in no means trying to convince you that we should live like we lived in pre-industrial times. That makes no sense. However, that being said, I believe there's a lot of lessons to be learned and drawn from vernacular architecture, which was amongst other things limited by the fact that they simply didn't have the luxury to thermally condition their spaces, either because they didn't have the technology or because energy was just too expensive. That explains in part why houses here in Belgium are made of heavy mass materials such as brick or stone and are compact and several stories high. That allowed heat dissipation to be slowed down and made better use of a hearth or a fireplace. You can also argue that the material was readily available, but a lot of materials were readily available, yet these prevailed because it's a sort of natural selection. These simply performed better in terms of energy. As I said before, the concept of sustainability has become increasingly powerful these last few decades. As beneficial as this awareness may be, it has brought with it some unwanted attention by having agents which are bringing to the table things that simply muddle the waters. This is not all bad, because at the end of the day, I think all plays in. But we have to discern what is really sustainable from what is not sustainable. I mentioned before how there's no clear consensus of what sustainability really is, but I'll be happy to share my own take on it. I believe that whatever you want to chase after, either adding biodiversity on site, using sustainable materials, reducing energy consumption, reducing embodied energy of your projects, whatever it is, it has to be incorporated into the project from the get-go, from the start. It has to be ingrained into the project. Otherwise, if you're simply adding it at the end of the project as an afterthought, that is, for me, simply greenwashing. And there are quite a few examples of that, which I simply don't care to show because I'm not here to shame anybody else's work. But when it comes to solar panels, I'll just be brief and say that we first have to focus on reducing the energy demand, and then we can focus on how we offset that demand through sustainable sources, such as solar panels. Finally, at the end of the day, sustainability is just another complexity layer to add into the design project. It's not something that has to guide the project through. We're not looking to have our buildings respond 100% to the climate. We have to balance that with the requirements from the client. We have to balance that also with the council regulations, municipal codes, etc. As an example, my climate here in Belgium would demand a compact building with as little thermal loss to the exterior as possible. That being said, that doesn't justify me building a windowless box, because that's not architecture. We do not have to just go and do everything 100% sustainable. But what we do need to know is that if we open a big window to the west because of a particular vista, we're going to get overheating a certain period of the year. We have to deal with that overheating, with that consequence of our action, which we can still take, but now we know what the consequences are. So the bottom line is, knowing the consequences and the impact of our decisions upon occupant comfort and behavior will make us overall much more powerful designers. And that, for me, is the point of designing sustainably. Well, if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I hope I haven't bored you, and I hope I have transmitted to you my passion towards sustainable design. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.